Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our final panel session, using body-worn cameras to improve organizational response to civil unrest. Points of view or opinions expressed herein do not necessarily represent the official position or policies of the U.S. Department of Justice. And I will now pass it off to Tom Woodmansey, Principal Advisor with CNA, to begin the session, using body-worn cameras to improve organizational response to civil unrest. Tom?
Thanks, Ellie. Welcome, everyone. Appreciate your time and patience with the session, and we're looking forward to this discussion. As Ellie mentioned, I'm a principal advisor with CNA. I'm also a retired police officer from Madison, Wisconsin, and I'm really pleased to be a part of this session to help moderate it. And I've been with the body-worn camera program for several years now, and I mentioned on one of the sessions yesterday what I'm really grateful for is how this program, BJ's program, affords us an opportunity to really share information, to learn from each other. And I think this meeting is demonstrating that. And we've got a great panel for this topic on civil unrest and the impacts of body-worn cameras. So our goal here is to have an interactive discussion. We want to hear from you as well. So by all means, use the chat, raise your hand, and Quinn, Allie, if a hand comes up and I don't see it, please interject. But as we're kicking off, I really, as I always do with every session, like to hear from John about the topic and his thoughts or comments as we roll out. So John, can you have any opening thoughts or comments?
Thanks, Tom. You always put me on the spot here. I don't know that I'm going to have any profound comments on this one. I think it's, obviously an interesting topic. Sort of juggling the First Amendment rights and freedom of expression in some of these events that might start out as, not as civil unrest, but as, just events or demonstrations, and the sort of the delicate balance that law enforcement officers have to play with allowing First Amendment rights versus, all the things that BWCs can bring to the table in terms of evidence. So I think this is just an interesting issue. We saw it play out, I think, in many instances over the past summer and the past two summers ago. And so I'll just leave it up to you, and maybe I'll have some comments at the end. But thanks, Tom, for it up.
Thanks, John. I appreciate that. Yeah, no, absolutely. Appreciate it as always. So I'll have some opening thoughts as we kick in, but let's now meet our panel. So I'll just ask that we have them introduce themselves. So I'm going to start with Dr. Jan Gobb from University of North Carolina, Charlotte. So Jan, would you mind introducing yourself?
Sure. As Tom said, I'm Dr. Jan Gobb. I'm an associate professor at UNC Charlotte. And I've been studying body cameras for almost a decade, I think. So I've been talking to agencies and working with the cameras for quite a while, and I've been working with TTA for almost as long. So I've been kind of seeing the trends through the agencies coming through this program, as well as just kind of in general.
Great, thanks, Jan. Appreciate it. And next, Captain Hook from Fairfax County Police Department. Brendan, would you introduce yourself, please?
Thank you. I am Captain Brendan Hook. Thank you for having me here today. I am the Assistant Director of our Information Technology Bureau, is my full-time job, and I am also an operational commander and the training commander for our Civil Disturbance Unit. Fairfax County is a large agency located outside of Washington, D.C. We're the largest municipal agency in Virginia. And we have roughly over 1,200 body camera operators on our department. And our program went live in 2020. And one of the people that helped founded our program I see is in this room today, and that's Major Christian Quinn, now retired.
Excellent, Captain. Thank you. And finally, Dr. Ed McGuire. Always happy to have Ed on these from Arizona State University. Ed?
Thanks, Tom. Ed McGuire from the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Arizona State University in Phoenix, and also head of our Public Safety Innovation Lab. I don't study body-worn cameras, but I do study police response to civil unrest, and so a lot of my work in that area has really led me to encounter sort of what went wrong, particularly in 2020 and some of the protests and riots since then with regard to body-worn camera use.
Great, thanks, Ed. So just some background on the session and what we are seeing around the country. It's such an important topic right now. Civil unrest has always been part of American policing, but it's now more than ever important for us to examine any ways that we can better prepare, address, and learn from it. The past few years, we all know have been different with protests, with a lot of the protests, a majority of them being directed towards police. So that has a different dynamic. So we are looking at how can body-worn camera help us with understanding what we can do for civil unrest. We are seeing agencies use body-worn camera around the country, developing promising practices for responses. They're using the footage, obviously, for things like tactics, use of force, resource allocation, policy and procedure, and communication, along with prevention strategies. And Captain Hook's going to talk about some of the prevention aspects where body-worn camera can play. Several of my colleagues and I were involved with some after-action reports over the past few years. And Quinn, if I could trouble you to put the article that Allie Land wrote on body-worn camera and after-action in the chat. You can also find it in the toolkit, but if people want to reference that, it's got some overviews of aspects of body-worn camera and how it's helped with after-action reviews. And today's topic is about civil unrest. And I think one of the things that we have learned from doing after-action reviews are themes that we see around the country. And one of the themes that stood out for me is departments said, we knew we were going to have these. We knew they're going to happen. We're not unaccustomed to them happening. We trained for them. We thought they were prepared. We thought we had adequate equipment. Our communication strategies were good. But we ended up being wrong. We ended up seeing a lot of holes in our approach and our training. So even the police department I worked for, I think I mentioned Madison Police Department, we are fairly renowned for having protests and civil unrest dating back to the Vietnam War. And even when I talked to our chief about the recent civil unrest, they weren't prepared as well as they wanted to, especially when they're seeing things like their police headquarters being firebombed. So not a plug for after action reports, but I think it's an element of this where body-worn camera can play a huge factor, whether you do a internal or external or a combination of both, just a review of what happened during your civil unrest and utilizing body-worn camera to provide you with additional means to examine what went well and what areas that you can improve upon. So I know that police love to say the totality of the circumstances. I've said that my whole life. I'll say it to my wife when I'm trying to make a really important point. It doesn't really work, but body-worn camera can really help us demonstrate the totality of circumstances when it comes to civil unrest. It doesn't capture everything, and I think this meeting has talked about that, and we all know that. But it really offers an unbiased insight into what officers face. So some of the things that we've seen with body-worn camera and how they can contribute to helping us with civil unrest go to training, use of force, communications, and especially with outside agencies. And I know Captain Hook can attest to this with how communications during vast civil unrest demonstrations, protests, the networking with outside agencies. You think you have it in place, and then you see how deficient it can be. Also, it does obviously aid with transparency during civil unrest, clarifying the police response, countering false narratives, and, importantly, demonstrating the good work that is done by police, the interactions that might go unnoticed otherwise, that need to be put out proactively to the community. And also, as we've talked about, and very near and dear to many of us are the officer wellness. Body-worn camera during civil unrest can offer validation, confirmation to the work that was done under chaotic circumstances. It can afford officers who are under a great deal of stress some validation about their actions, their behavior, and just what they went through. So those are just some things that we've learned over the past couple of years, especially when it relates to civil unrest and the nexus to body-worn cameras. So I'm going to turn it over to our panel for some questions for Q&A. And again, please do chime in. We want to hear your experiences and questions that you have. So let me start with you all, and then we'll just go down the line. Jan, you can start first. If you can just talk about your background and experience with body-worn camera and how you've seen it evolve over the past few years, obviously relating to civil unrest to some degree, but talk about just your background, because you have, like you mentioned, 10 years plus.
Well, not quite 10 years plus, but but almost 10 years. But yes, so I started working on body cameras when they were not very common, and so I've seen them expand dramatically across the United States and elsewhere. Right, we see them across the globe, and so I've seen body cameras become an expectation that people have. We went from no one really knew about body cameras, and in our initial studies we would see that people didn't know that there were cameras on their officers because they didn't see them day to day, and now it's just become this expectation that everyone's going to have camera, and that's not always the case. That there is a camera present, but that's become a social expectation, which affects how people approach the response to large scale demonstrations, whether those are rise to the level of being protests or if and how peaceful those are, right? But those large scale demonstrations and events, people have this now expectation of body camera footage being present, and that may or may not be the case depending on the policy, which I know we're getting to later. But I've seen a dramatic expansion in the use of cameras, but then also with that comes what officers expect to come from cameras and their benefits and drawbacks, but also social expectations, and those are not always aligned, I guess is probably a good word to use. So there's not always a lot of alignment with how what the public has as expectations and what the police have as expectations.
Give it a little bit more, Jan, if you don't mind, about the expectations. Is it just the understanding
Sure.
about accountability, transparency, and
Yeah.
what?
So fair. So I think a lot of people, just general population, right? People expect that body camera footage is going to be available. It's going to be readily accessible. I live in North Carolina. That is absolutely not the case. So I see that all the time. But not varies state by state, but people have an expectation that there's going to be footage. It's going to be made available. It's going to be useful. To them, it's going to prove. You talked about it's an impartial observer, right? We expect it to be this kind of neutral observer. That's not always the case. There's limitations with what a body camera can see, what it can pick up, in terms of audio and video, and most people don't have any understanding of those limitations. Just the general population doesn't necessarily have an understanding of those limitations, and so it becomes then incumbent on police to kind of sort of educate people on the utility, that there is still utility in body cameras, but there might be some limitations to what can be seen, or policy restrictions and how it can be released or things like that. And so a lot of time, what we've seen over time is officers tend to focus on their expectations of cameras being very positive for them, right? You kind of alluded to it. The camera will show the officer doing the right thing. It will show the officer false allegations, right? Protect them against false allegations and citizen complaints. And we've seen this happen. I mean, I've heard from countless sergeants that is the case. But the expectation of the public is typically related to, as you said, accountability and transparency. And so when those things don't happen, then they start to wonder, why are we spending all this money on a technology that I'm not seeing a return on investment for, right? So
Good.
It's just, there's a little bit of misalignment in the expectations or the values placed on that.
That's great. And I know Captain Hook's going to touch on this later on during our Q&A, so I appreciate you following up with that. I appreciate it. So Captain, when I turn to you next about just your background and experience with body-worn camera over the past few years and how you've seen it evolve in correlations to civil unrest, of course.
Sure. Well, so I formally entered the body-worn camera realm, when we were finishing our first evolution of body-worn camera and entering our second, and I'll explain that in a minute. But I had previously led our computer forensics division, and as we were beginning to roll out the body-worn cameras, there was some consultation done on how we would recover data from cameras, and ultimately that kind of solved itself with the design of the product and how it's uploaded. So forensics isn't typically needed to recover any sort of footage from body-worn cameras. But the second evolution for us has involved an upgrade to a new camera system or new camera hardware, body 3s, along with additional products to help trigger the cameras, right? So we've noticed gaps where officers are forgetting to activate and sincerely forgetting, right? There were a few cases where officers were surprised by gunmen after they'd been inventorying a car for an hour, things like that. So we've upgraded to some accessories like signal sidearm, which when the officer draws the weapon from their holster, that activates the camera. So we're currently looking at the third and fourth evolution of body cameras, which would be upgrades on the cameras, but also beginning to integrate some sort of data analytics layer for compliance, also for measuring how keyword searches, things like that. And then eventually integration for real-time interfacing with a real-time crime center to allow for support from specialists, whether it's a mental health specialist, to communicate through the body camera or even language translators. In the realm of civil disturbance, like I said, we began our deployment in 2020, kind of just before the pandemic. The large scale deployment, we had done tests and pilots before that. And the plan was to incrementally roll this program out through different districts over some time. Pandemic hits, and then George Floyd, and our political leadership wanted to accelerate that program. So we began to accelerate that through 2020. And then in January 6, 2021, our civil disturbance unit responded to the Capitol, and we had a mixed kind of fleet where some people had body cameras, others didn't, because we still had not finished the deployment. And then the civil disturbance unit is made up of officers from all assignments, not just patrol, which had been the focus of rolling out the body cameras at that time. And our policy and protocol about deploying body cameras and when to record was still being refined. So most of the people recording signal activations did that, but we've refined that since, where when we have time to discuss something before deployment, which we did not have time to do on January 6th, we remind people about the protocol for how and when to record a protest versus a riot or insurrection.
Thanks, Captain. And from having many discussions with you, I know that you have a vast array of information surrounding January 6th and lessons that can be learned. So we're really happy to have you on this call. So Dr. McGuire, opening comments.
Yeah, I mean, just from the perspective of somebody who, has ended up reviewing a lot of what went right and what went wrong in the protests in 2020, and certainly events prior to that, but especially since, with body cameras being rolled out more and more with each passing year. Just some of the patterns that I'm seeing. And so, one very clear pattern across agencies is some agencies have really clear policies on, when it's appropriate for officers to both wear and activate body-worn cameras, and some don't. And sometimes there are unit level policies, not just overall agency policies, but unit level policies that are not so clear. One example, for instance, is, some agencies don't have tactical teams, SWAT teams, where body-worn cameras or activate body-worn cameras during tactical operations. But then what is a tactical operation? So is responding to a protest or a riot a tactical operation? If it's deemed, in this case by, for instance, a SWAT commander, that responding to a protest or a riot is a tactical operation, then you have no SWAT officers wearing or activating their body-worn cameras. And that can be really problematic, since those officers are often heavily involved in the response to these types of events. That was sort of a common pattern that we saw in 2020 and afterwards. Another pattern is just, a policy is put in place Maybe it's really unclear, or maybe it's crystal clear, but there's no training or no mechanism for helping officers understand what's required of them within the policy. And so we saw that quite a bit as well. Technical issues came up with regard to mounting body-worn cameras to protective gear and issues like that, and cameras falling off and insufficient mounting mechanisms, things like that. I know agencies have been working with vendors to try to address that issue. We saw a lot of instances of supervisors just simply not ensuring compliance with body-worn camera policies when those policies were in place. And in some cases, even violating those policies themselves, either by not wearing or activating their own body-worn cameras, or in some more egregious instances, actually ordering officers to shut their body-worn cameras off prior to using force against crowds. So, we have several instances around the country where people were very seriously injured with eye injuries and orbital fractures and skull fractures and so forth, where you have entire lines of officers there, not one of them had their body-worn camera activated to capture that really sort of pretty serious, potentially life-threatening injury. And we saw many instances of officers violating body-worn camera policies with impunity. These all combined with some other issues that are sort of related but not directly on point, like unclear use of force reporting policies, or just inadequate use of force reporting by officers. And so if you take it as a package, you've got officers either not wearing or activating their cameras, you've got reports not being written or being submitted weeks or months later. What you end up with is kind of an environment of no accountability. And so sort of, I think today, if administrators want to have like a checklist of sort of how do I make sure we're on the right track to create an environment of accountability and transparency and to avoid municipal liability, it's have a clearly written policy in place, have the training in place to make sure the officers know what's in the policy and what they're supposed to do, making sure supervisors are ensuring compliance with the policy and holding officers accountable for violating the policy, I think are just some of the clear lessons that popped out of 2020 and some of the protests since then.
Ed, let me just follow up. Something that you said triggered a question from having interviewed a lot of officers with some of these after action reports. The chaos that ensues, the 12, 15-hour days that they're subjected to, and then, there were times where officers would say, look, I utilized or had to use force, whether it be OC deployment, baton, and I still had to stay in the field. And then they would neglect to write a sufficient report. It just wasn't a top priority given everything you're trying to save the city from burning. So do you have any suggestions, or have you learned anything about what you would say? Because you're talking about the civil liability, about the importance of capturing and documenting the uses of force, whether it be the officers have to be removed from the street, take the time, go back, look at the footage, or just provide accurate police reports. And I hope I didn't catch you off guard with that, but that came up.
No, absolutely. It definitely was an issue. I mean, you had officers in some cases working 16 and 18-hour days and, having to go home, not get very much sleep, and then somehow, be back at work the next morning to do it all over again in the case of these multi-day protests. And so certainly, the challenges were innumerable with officer exhaustion, threats to their health and wellness and safety. And, so certainly some really challenging stuff. And when it comes to some of the litigation that has arisen as a result of 2020, you end up seeing themes that in certain places that where, quite frankly, it just looks really bad. You've got an entire row of officers, not one of whom managed to activate a body-worn camera. And, you've got pretty serious injuries to people in the crowd. Like I say, in some cases, literally losing an eye or an orbital fracture, a skull fracture, not a single report, not a single body-worn camera video, right? So things like this, a lot of this litigation is based on a legal principle, what they call Monell liability or civil liability, the extent to which municipal liability, the extent to which a municipality has been irresponsible in its duty to supervise and train officers appropriately. And when you have these instances where you're going to have a lot of instances of things happening, body-worn cameras falling off, somebody forgetting to turn on a camera, somebody forgetting to write a report, where you have these individual instances of things. But what happens in some of the civil litigation that we're seeing is it just starts to look almost like a pattern or practice, right? Like sort of a more widespread kind of pattern of just not wanting to be held accountable. And so certainly I think those one-offs, where somebody's really tired and they couldn't manage to write things down, somebody, their camera fell off or they forgot to turn it on. These things are to be expected in these really chaotic instances. Unfortunately, it looks a little more widespread in some of these cases.
Good, thank you. And goes to, how do you communicate that to the community that it wasn't intentional? If it wasn't intentional, what can you do? The reasonable expectation. So, Captain, let me ask you about, and you brought this up when we had our prep talk about strategies that can be used in releasing body-worn camera footage to potentially prevent civil unrest. Everything we tend to focus on is after the fact. So prevention, proactivity. Talk about that, Brendan.
Yeah, so that's funny you should mention that. An example that's just happened 2 days ago, and what I'll say is the first layer of that is identification, where executive leadership can tell, do we have a problem or not, right? Because that body camera, the expectation is that the chief is going to want to see that video when he's on the scene. So that helps him assess, and our leadership understands that's not the whole story, but a lot of times it gives you a good indication, what do we need to prepare for here, right? And the example I'm referring to, there was no issue, right? But it allowed them to make that quick assessment that how we communicate and what steps we take to for the investigation and notifications to prevent that civil unrest. I think at a national level, we can look at how the recent case in Memphis was handled, just in such a way where the video was released, the communication was clear, and I think it built trust with the community. And I know that what many people on the call, if you're on law enforcement, might know, but if you're not, you might not know, because of the environment we're in, we stood up, half a platoon of CDU, not knowing how this was going to be received. But I think it took a lot of wind out of the sails of people that wanted to maybe engage in civil unrest because of the transparency and the attempt to rebuild trust after what was so clearly a bad and criminal incident. So I'm not a public affairs professional, but what I'll tell you is we will invite the media in. We'll have what we call a packaged reel with some graphics and context provided to help add a little bit of a bigger picture to the body-worn camera. And I think we've seen Las Vegas do a really good job with this. LA does. And that involves a lot of work from our public affairs folks, and then really good strategic communication from our leadership. And it's not just throwing the video out there. It's a press conference, and it's providing a lot of context about the law, what procedural steps we're taking, and the status of the investigation. So it has to be more than just throwing the video up on a website. There has to be really strategic communication, and that really counts on your agency having prior existing relationships with the media and building trust with the community beforehand. So I'll also add, while we have that packaged material and video, many times the raw file is provided to the media. But if you watch body-worn camera videos, releasing the whole video is just, it's cumbersome and not really very interesting, quite honestly. You'll have 2 hours of a camera looking at the back of a cruiser while nothing's really going on. So I think communicating that out as well as, hey, this is packaged, but we think we got everything here. Take a look for yourself, but a lot of times the media is not going to want to comb through hours and hours and hours and hours of video, which is just probably radio traffic going back and forth. So I think that we've seen a lot of agencies go to that model, and I know it's been successful for us as well. And even in times when it's unclear, because we've had a recent incident again that it's a bit unclear as what happened, but at least putting the video out there, the public can identify, like, hey, even with this video, it's really kind of tough to figure out what happened there. We're not hiding anything. It's just going to take time to investigate. So, and I think the public's perception and sophistication has improved since the advent of body cameras to digest that it's not the whole story.
That was what I was going to actually ask you and follow up, that there has been some education, and that may take throughout the country, that may take baby steps with some places that don't have that luxury of having to go through it like you had so frequently. Do you recommend having, when you're having someone articulate the footage and the assessment of what's going on, it be a public information officer, a tactical officer, a sworn officer? Is there anything, you know, that's communicating directly to the media on what they're seeing?
The way our agency normally does it is our chief or a chief level will be the one up there, and then the public affairs will be there to handle some of the kind of more the logistics and assisting with some of the Q&A. But really, it needs to be high leadership to own this. And what I'll also say, and I forgot to mention, is when we provide that package, it includes things that help provide more context, including radio traffic, in-car videos, CCTV footage, just to really give the whole picture of this is what we're looking at. Maybe we've made a decision, maybe we haven't, but this is what we're assessing. And I think coming from a leader and someone that's in charge of making a decision, or at least conducting the investigation, is also very important, with partnership with your public affairs.
Okay, great. Thank you. Jan, talk about policy, specific language. Is it important to have specific language and policy regarding civil unrest? What's the importance of this and the dangers of not having it?
Sure. And I know Ed kind of talked about this a little bit, but so in the study that we did using grantee agencies, we found that most agencies didn't, specifically regarding the 2020 protests, most agencies didn't have specific language for using cameras, deploying cameras in what we call large scale demonstrations. So the majority of them rely on just standard language that you use for standard encounters, right? You you shall turn on your camera when you have a law enforcement encounter, whatever that was. So then it was left to officers to interpret what that meant in the context of a protest, right? It was when a protest takes place for hours. Well, is that whole hour, multiple hour long encounter considered a law enforcement encounter? Or is it not? Is it only if you have something happen? And then in which case, then you end up with a lot of people forgetting to turn cameras on, as Ed was talking about, because, they're happening really fast, right? Those are fast paced, something happens suddenly and then they need to use force or something like that. And then they haven't turned their camera on. And so what was happening is you had a lot of officers who just didn't know whether they were supposed to turn their camera on or not. And then you run into battery life issues, you run into recording capacity problems because you can't have your camera on for your 15-hour shift, right? Or whatever, it ends up becoming, because there's this protest going on. And so it became very difficult for, then in the back end, right, then you don't have footage because the camera ran out, right? The camera ran out of juice, it ran out of capacity. And so then there's just missing footage. And so then best case scenario, it just looks bad, right? Like it just has bad optics, but then you might legitimately have serious problems where you don't have footage you really need, right? You don't have that evidence when something happened, and you need that for evidentiary purposes, or you need that to clear an officer from a citizen complaint because it's just not present. And so having really clear language, and Ed kind of alluded to this as well, that, when it's not just having clear language, but it's defining precisely what you mean by something. What is a large scale demonstration? What is a protest? What qualifies as that? Are you going to have the capacity built in to, if you're going to have them turn it on for the whole time, that's fine, but you have to have a capacity to match that, right? So we're going to have backup cameras for people to switch them out and things like that. And just people, I think, didn't really think about those issues, and then they were faced with these problems, and especially when it's an issue of agency size, right? So a lot of protests I think a lot of people tend to think protests happen in very large cities and with large agencies, but you might be having a smaller agency that called in for mutual aid, or you have a smaller agency that has just a neighboring agency that's helping out, or a protest ends up happening in multiple places. We saw that in 2020, where you had a lot of smaller agencies that maybe aren't used to having demonstrations having to deal with this. And so it's very important to have clear language, a differentiated policy, and to Ed's point earlier as well, maybe unit level policies. A separate area of my research is body cameras on specialized units, and it's amazing to me the number of agencies that don't have specific policies for those units, whether it's tactical units or canine units or it's pick a unit. All of those units might be used during protests, and they don't have specific policies, even just for their unit, let alone then a differentiated policy for protests. So it's incredibly important.
Excellent. I appreciate it. And as we move on, just a reminder to check your chat. I know John posted a couple references to First Amendment issues, and Quinn just posted Dr. Gobb's study that she was referring to. So please do take a look. Okay, let's move on. Ed, good question. I think the mechanisms you've seen for communicating policy relating to civil unrest, which is kind of a follow-up to Jan's discussion as well. So what can you add to that?
Well, I mean, it could be a brief training module, it doesn't necessarily even have to be in person. It could be a brief online training module that just explains to officers, here's the language in the policy, or here's a policy revision, and here's what we mean by it. And, what we saw in some agencies was a policy would be put in place, and literally, 6 or 7 or 8 years later, officers really still don't really know what they're supposed to do. I mean, there's some policy sitting in a manual somewhere that at some point got emailed to them, just the policy, got emailed to them, and hopefully some of you are better at reading your emails than I am, but we need some kind of indication that this person has read the policy, that you've hopefully not just given it to them, but explained it to them, whether that's in a brief training module in person, whether that's at roll call, whether that's in an online training module that's, again, can be really brief, but just helps officers understand exactly what you expect from them. Because as in any workplace, it doesn't have to be policing. It could be in my own realm of academia. Anytime you're putting some policy language in place, there needs to be a credible attempt to help ensure that the employees just simply know what's expected of them. And unfortunately, we saw many instances in 2020 protests and beyond, where officers just simply didn't know what was expected of them. And so some attempt on behalf of the agency. I think some agencies do a really good job whenever there's policy changes of sending out clear bulletins to help officers understand, here's what changed, here's what's expected of you. Usually it involves more than just sending the language. Some of these policies, can sound pretty legalistic, I think, to officers and mere mortals like me, right? And just kind of trying to help make that arcane policy language more accessible to humans, right? By, again, just brief training modules or, plain English kinds of summaries about what's expected. I think all of that would help improve compliance.
Good. And I vividly remember receiving emails, to your point, if you open this email, you have hereby been officially notified that you're under this policy. And I think that was a long time ago, but I do think, to your point too about the training modules, Officers want to know why the policy is in place too. What is the basis behind this change or addition to it? And sometimes it's common sense and obvious, but I also think currently now, not that there isn't still civil unrest, but it's not to the magnitude it has been, that with new hires, new academies, there's a great opportunity for body-worn camera to be utilized in in-service, pre-service trainings and discussions on policy as to why this is occurring and why we've modified. So appreciate that, Ed. Brendan, lessons learned, and I think we throw this out to the entire panel and anybody in the audience as well, of course, about how to manage reasonable expectations and how far body-worn camera is able to capture events. And of course, relating to civil unrest, but you can, I mean, this can belong to any part of body-worn camera, of course. So what can you tell us about your experiences?
Well, I'll start off with addressing Ed's last point about training, and I couldn't agree more. And I'll say, when time permits during briefings, that's a commander's responsibility to remind people of important policies like that. And it's also part of our training where to join the civil disturbance unit, significant amount of basic training is required. And we really emphasize the difference between a protest and an unlawful activity, right? So then when we do a briefing, hey, we're preparing for a protest today, unless the commander or supervisor tells you to, as long as it doesn't convert to something else, we're not turning these on, right? So the lessons learned is that we've done a lot of training recently on our civil disturbance from kind of these British model, right? And a lot of that has to do with how to build relationships beforehand and then how to deploy as a unit. And one thing they touch on a lot is the role of the evidence gatherer. So when you're moving as a unit, the body camera is really only going to capture, and it's not really a great perspective because it's from the chest in most places right now. It's not from up here on the eyes. It's hard to capture the broader movement of both the unit and then the entire crowd, what you're doing, what's going on in front of you, when really you might be just being given an order over the radio, hey, we need you to move this way and deploy this force. So a practical experience on this is you're going to have a lot more gear on you when you're deployed in something that's beyond a protest. So you're going to have a lot more pads, you're going to have a lot more just equipment, and you're going to be closer. And a lot of times that involves stacking up. And I can think back to the Capitol, we were all stacked up. So the cameras are just literally looking at the person in front of you. And then when you deploy, in some situations, you're going to have a shield in front of you. And that shield, although clear, it's not really that clear. You can't see through it that well. And lighting conditions, you add tear gas or smoke on top of that, you're going to get a picture that it's chaotic. How helpful is it to identify a particular use of force or an assault? It's questionable. And that's why I go back to the role of the evidence gatherer, which is something we've implemented, which is someone sitting back with a camera to capture that broader view. So when something does happen, they begin to record and they can identify, okay, here's the movement of the unit. Here's the commands that were given. And we're very intentional to make sure that we capture the commands. We had a recent protest that converted into an unlawful assembly. We had to issue some commands via megaphone and speakers through the cruisers. So we had people placed strategically so we could later say, okay, the body camera picked it up over here, but really to capture that broader angle, you need an evidence gatherer. And that's someone that we have that's from our technical investigations unit that we embed into our civil disturbance unit. They're trained in how to use cameras. They're also trained in CDU. So they're able to kind of go back and forth. They're going to move with the unit to be safe, but we train at multiple levels and we let people know this is why we're doing this. So it helps protect us from civil liability, but also helps us with criminal prosecution and then really evaluating our own tactics to make sure they were sound and to make sure that we really want to prevent things from escalating. So was that command heard? Do we need to use LRADs? Do we need to use different equipment to communicate across different spaces? So that's the way that we can help capture those things. But I just think the body cameras, like in many other police incidents, it's not going to tell you the whole story. And particularly when you add a lot more gear, people, and and kind of really mixed environments to that scenario, it might even lessen the scope on their utility.
Well, I was just say from the flip side, the public perception, right, is important too, managing the expectations of the public and how, because he's absolutely right. You're not probably going to see a whole lot, and what you do see is going to be really chaotic. And I'll even add in what you hear is very chaotic, right? So the audio isn't even that great, especially if you're adding in wind and just loud noise and everything going on, right? So you can't even really hear that much. You can't really see that much. So you have to also contextualize that for the untrained observer, right? The average person. And so that's where I think the captain's mention of their kind of curated sort of, I guess that's my word, curated video release, right, is really helpful, because it can provide other vantage points and things like that. But because you really do have to contextualize that, what exactly is the camera going to capture? You know, it probably the back of the person in front of them for a lot of this, right? Or through a black or a very hazy, shield. And so then people get really upset that then that transparency and that accountability is sort of difficult to use, to have the cameras be used for that, because it's unclear. And so, and that's a different set of kind of managing expectations, right, than it is to manage the expectations internally, which are also important. But both sides, I think, are important and take a different kind of approach.
Good. And to that, and actually to the point that the captain made, and Jan, you did earlier, I'm just following up with this, looking at training opportunities. I know we've had some agencies that we've worked with who have very specific language in their policy that you shall not engage verbally with protesters other than commands, directives, orders. And to your point, Brendan, about prevention, I think we're learning, and we've seen, and I know from my department as well, what we learned about the importance of engaging, but communication with protesters. And is there an opportunity for body-worn camera to be utilized to show the importance of verbally engaging, diffusing, humanizing officers talking? So I'll ask you, Captain, and see if anybody else has any additional on that. I think it's a softball question, but I think touch on it, because I'm surprised there's still policy out there that says you shall not.
Well, Tom, thank you for asking the question. And I'll say that, I mean, shockingly, it is a departure from tactics we were taught 15 years ago or so. But engaging with the crowd, particularly before things happen, is vital. And we actually just had Dr. Tamara Herald here at our command staff talking about that. I think some of you are familiar with her and her work on crowd psychology and crowd dynamics. So engaging with the crowd is really important, but then we can use that for training, because when we're teaching new recruits about CDU, we'll walk up to the crowd, typically look for a leader, and I'll tell them, hey, I'd like to record this activity, but I want to give them a little bit of power in that dynamic. I'll say, is that okay with you? And sometimes they'll say yes, sometimes they'll say no, but it allows me to capture what is hard to explain to people that haven't done it, which is, what is your intention today? And most of the groups are very forthright. They'll say, my intention is to be arrested today. And that doesn't happen that often in police work. And when you're trying to teach someone who's never had to experience that, of, hey, these are people that are protesting. They might even have views that we don't agree with, or they don't like us. But if you maintain professionalism with them and clear and open communication, you can get to their intent. You can calibrate your response appropriately, and then you're documenting that, so there's no kind of way to muddy those waters later if something were to change or somebody were to have said, I never said that. So I think being able to record that kind of can make the unbelievable all of a sudden very believable for people that just have never been in a protest or a riot. And that's really the value of the body cameras. Of it can help show the value of, you have to humanize, you have to communicate with people. People protesting are not the enemy. They're allowed to do that, and we are there to help facilitate that. And showing that can help really change the mindset a little bit and teach the difference between a protest and then criminal activity. So it helps make it real.
I'll jump in on that if it's okay. So I have a guidebook that I wrote, freely available if any of you are interested, on the website of the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation, called Policing Protests. Maybe someone can throw the link up there. But dialogue and de-escalation are the centerpieces of the strategy that I recommend in that guidebook. We've got more than 4 decades of crowd psychology research at this point that says dialogue is extremely useful in de-escalating and reducing tensions and reducing conflict. And one of the things we're really starting to learn here is not just how officers conduct themselves verbally, but even non-verbally. So we do a lot of interviews with protesters at different types of protest events, and also surveys following protest events of people who were present. And one of the things we've learned from that research is that crowd members are extremely sensitive to not only how officers talk to them, or if officers talk to them, but even things like facial expressions and these nonverbal forms of communication. And what we end up hearing just over and over again after surveying protesters in multiple cities around the country is things like, the officer just looked like he wanted to hurt me. The officer looked angry. The officer seemed like he hated us. Like these kinds of things. Those are officers who are not even talking. They're just standing there, right, in a formation. But then when you add in some of the things that some of the unfortunate things that officers do choose to say at these types of events, it can really not only increase tension and conflict, but we have research evidence that when people believe officers are behaving or speaking to them in an inappropriate manner, the likelihood of them wanting to hurt officers, resist officers, throw things or fight back or any of this kind of thing increases. So there's actually an officer safety issue here as well. And I couldn't agree more with what Captain just said, which is anything police can do in these moments to humanize themselves not only will reduce the likelihood of tension and conflict, will actually make them safer.
Thanks, Ed. I appreciate it. And I know from some of the reviews of body-worn camera footage I looked at, even the tactics of large group of officers going to disperse a crowd as compared to smaller units of one-on-one, that strategy, it seems far more effective and less likely to increase the tension. I know obviously it's situational, but appreciate that. And so let me, to the audience, we've got a few minutes left. Please throw out any questions, throw it in the chat, raise your hand. I'll ask the panel another question or two, but if you have any, not even questions, if you have any experiences from this that relates to what we're talking about, by all means, throw it out there that we can learn from each other. So just take a pause for that. Does anybody want to come on with a question? I'll throw one final question to the group, and I'll start with Dr. Gobb with this one about the timely importance of releasing footage. And we're talking a lot about civil unrest related to protests, but obviously this can be associated with any incident. An officer involved shooting, significant uses of force where the unrest comes from. And we are learning over the past few years, I think body-worn camera footage is really highlighting this, that sometimes the concerns about evidence and contaminating evidence and withholding information to the community that's up in arms, or as one chief described it, my community's on fire, and the importance of getting that footage out to clarify or to help mitigate misunderstandings or misinformation. So can you just talk about the importance of releasing information, body-worn camera footage when it's needed?
A few things I can. So it's really important it's a fine line, I guess we should say, you don't necessarily want to rush and release footage without a clear understanding of what's going on, right? So we've seen several instances where chiefs will wait so that they can kind of get a full understanding of what's going on. Otherwise, they can't even answer questions, right? They can't provide that context that the captain was referring to. But at the same time, there should be some response and some release of footage. And like I alluded to the fact, I live in North Carolina, where you need a court order to release footage, and it can be very complicated, and it can be very detrimental to police public relations, right? That footage can't be released, and then people can't see what's going on, and people then again come back to, this was supposed to be an accountability tool, this was supposed to be a transparency tool, this isn't happening, why do we have this? This is just a tool to perpetuate the continued use of that it's going to help police, but it's not going to help the public, and we don't get to see. I think there was again this expectation that there would be this level of accountability, and a public expectation of that. And if you don't release footage, and in many cases in North Carolina, that does happen, that they don't get footage never gets released. It'll come out in court, right? But it does, if it goes that far, but it's not going to come out to the public, and so then it becomes problematic, and it can actually create civil unrest, right? Because then people are upset about it. In the instances of civil disturbances, again, you have to be careful, because if you're just releasing footage, but there's no context provided to it, then it's going to look like there's nothing. Well, I can't even see anything. Again, what's the point of this? This isn't useful. There's no utility here. And so, but it is very important to use body cameras not only in a evidentiary context, which I think is the kind of key number one reason sort of that agencies get cameras, is there's this great evidentiary opportunity here, and so then it's evidence, so I'm going to keep it, right, and I'm going to keep it insulated internally, and so it's also a great opportunity to kind of liaise with your community and provide that transparency and that dialogue and that conversation of, here's what's going on, here's maybe what we're still looking for, here's still what we're still looking at, and what we're still investigating, and where questions still remain. But then it can quell things before things get out of hand. And so that becomes very important. But it is a fine line, because there's absolutely an understandable need to keep footage kind of contained until you have kind of something to provide, right? Some answers to questions to provide.
Sure. Thanks, Jan. And a question did come in, and it's a question that I think we won't know the answer to but I'll throw it out to the group about, is there ever an occasion where the officers reposition themselves to get a better recording of a critical incident? Now, I'm imagining, yes, absolutely. I don't have an example of that. So Captain Hook, does that resonate with you for a specific example?
It does. And what I'll say is we see it all the time for traffic stops, criminal interdiction, crime scenes, see it all the time. In civil unrest, when you convert from a First Amendment activity to unlawful activity, and I'll mention Nicholas's comments here in a moment because it's related. The officers on the front line that had to respond to something that's happening to them quickly, that's going to be a very tough situation. And we recently had a protest involving foreign prime minister visiting and two sides outside of the Ritz-Carlton up in Tyson's. Every year they come and protest. We were totally caught off guard. This year they just started fighting. There was a mob assault. We quickly converted. You see people tapping, but it was such a large mob assault going awry that in fact, we have so many videos, and we're going through and trying to go back and charge people, but almost we did not have intent to capture them because we were just responding to a really rapidly evolving situation, which goes to Nicholas's point. And his comment is, I was a riot control officer in Germany. We had designated officers that filmed the incident with a handheld camera. The footage was later reviewed in order to identify suspects, training purposes, et cetera. So in the example I gave, that was the first time we deployed with that European model with exactly what Nicholas talked about, with an evidence gatherer, and deployed exactly how Nicholas is talking about. And that's kind of where we've been able to really be more intentional with that evidence gatherer role. The body-worn camera in a civil unrest, it can just happen so quickly that it's hard to have that intent at that moment. But in police work in general, yes, we see that being used all the time.
Good. And I was going to follow up with that point that you made too about the body-worn camera doesn't substitute the value of an overarching position camera, videoing from different spots that is evidence-based or giving a broader picture of the civil unrest. So thank you. Well, we've reached the end of the discussion. I really want to thank the panel. I think it was a really good discussion. We could go on, and please, by all means, we're going to continue with this. If you and your agencies have examples, please send them to us, or anything that can be learned from each other for this. So with that, I want to thank John and BJA and our panel. Thank you all.